Hi, everyone. My name is Fred Barnett. I'm the president and founder of Anthem Imports. We specialize in importing world whiskey, and so today we're here to talk about the world whiskey category and great spirits from great places. So first, we'll start with a quick overview, that's me, of the United States market. These are sales in 9-liter cases in the United States. As you can see, the whiskey from Canada, Scotland, Ireland, and the United States accounts for 99% of whiskey consumed in the U.S. I believe that this is going to be something that changes very quickly over the next few years. Most of the rest of that 1% actually comes from Japan. Japan has done an incredible job of building up their whiskey to where they can pretty much now be included as one of the traditional whiskey producing countries. It doesn't come without some cautionary tales from Japan, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. So world whiskey is essentially whiskey produced from any of the countries outside these. They're whiskey's produced in most places throughout the world where people live. Some of the distilleries are fairly small, but others are gaining in production. We also would include, while they're not necessarily considered world whiskeys, it's important to take note of things like domestic single malt whiskeys produced in the United States or rye whiskeys from a place like Scotland, where our Bicky produces some very interesting rye whiskeys. This is a map from the Whiskey Atlas Europe showing whiskey production in Europe. And I think most people will be surprised when they see these numbers. Right now, when we think about whiskey from Europe, we think about Scotch and Irish whiskey. There are actually more than twice as many whiskey-producing distilleries here in Germany as there are in Scotland. And if you look at Germany and France combined, it's twice as many as Scotland and Ireland combined. There's whiskey produced in most of Western Europe, and that is inching further east every year. So next, I think it's important to discuss on why world whiskey is an emerging category. From a production standpoint, it's enticing for folks to be able to produce a world-class spirit using locally grown grain and also from using local distillation methods that may be completely different than how things are done in Scotland. There's also a push, I think, these days for a dichotomy between the hyper-local and then exotic. So while it's fun to try something new and exciting and unique from a distillery down the street that's made using locally produced grains, it's also really cool to go out and sample a whiskey that's produced from a place that you may have traveled to or dream about traveling to or where you have family ties to from a long time ago. So we're seeing just a lot of growth in that. Scotland itself imports a lot of barley into the country, and so I think that it's just the next natural step for a lot of these places that are producing barley and selling it to Scotland for Scotland to use to make whiskey. Well, why don't we make our own whiskey with that and do it with our own methods and kind of tweak how that's always been done. Also, some of these countries now have access to do some experiments involving some exciting and interesting casks that have never been used, and to do things that have never been attempted in Scotland. So, for example, I import a whiskey from Germany, and they use freshly emptied German Pinot Noir barrels to age their whiskeys in. There's also an example, a whiskey in Gascony in France could use French wine casks or Armagnac casks or both to make a whiskey that's not like nothing else produced in Scotland. So this is kind of an overview of the recognition of some of the larger world whiskeys that are out there. I think a lot of credit goes to Suntory, who has done an incredible job marketing their whiskeys over the last few decades. They have certainly are whiskeys that when everyone thinks about world whiskey, they think about the Japanese whiskeys, and in fact, they've done such a great job that whiskey, Japan can now be looked at as a traditional whiskey-producing country, like I mentioned earlier. There has been, I think, a hard lesson that Japan has had to learn in that their products got too popular too quickly, and they have had issues allocating the products out there. So while you might love Yamazaki, you probably can't find a bottle of it. Cavalon has done an incredible job as well, and I think that they've learned the lesson from Suntory's issues with their allocation. You can certainly find Cavalon on the shelves of most high-end bars and retailers, and they've done a really good job getting a ton of ratings and a ton of recognition for what they're doing. Next up would be Sullivan's Cove in Australia. They've really managed to put the entire Australian whiskey industry on the map. They've encouraged a lot of local distilleries to go out there and produce stuff as well. They've won great awards like World's Best Single Malt Whiskey, World's Best Single Cask Single Malt Whiskey. And while they have suffered from some of the issues that Suntory's suffered from in terms of having really great whiskeys that can be expensive and hard to get, they've really have encouraged a lot of people out there. And then I would have to mention Terrampelli, which Ansi, of course, we'll talk more about soon, but they've had some incredible luck at some of these rating competitions, getting 95-plus point ratings on some of their main whiskeys. And then also last year, they beat out, from IWSC, they were named Worldwide Whiskey Producer of the Year, beating Cavalon and also a little distillery in Kentucky called Buffalo Trace. So they're getting that global recognition. So I want to talk about the future of the whiskey retail set and also the past and how it's evolved over the years. So in the US, there was always kind of a bourbon set and a Scotch set. And then a few decades ago, with the rise of single malts, you started to see things broken out. You'd still see bourbon, and then you'd see single malts, but it would be more geographically driven. You'd see your Highlands, Lowlands, Speyside, and so on. And as that's sort of evolved, now you're starting to see the emergence of a Japanese section within that set. I believe next we'll start to see kind of just a general Europe set, and then that's going to further break down a little bit further, where we'll see Nordic whiskeys. We may see German whiskeys or Alpine whiskeys to focus on, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And then further into French and things like that, where you're going to start to see it look more like a wine section in a store, where you'll see things broken out like Burgundy, Bordeaux, Alsatian, just kind of different things based on how they're going to taste. The U.S. market, if you're considering entering the U.S. market, there's some things to consider. First of all, it's a mistake to think of the U.S. as a market. It's really 51 separate markets that are very distinct. They all have their own silly rules and regulations. Also, it's important to know that education, especially in this category, is extremely important. Nobody knows what world whiskey is yet. We're trying to build a following, and I think we're doing a great job, all of us whiskey importers and folks that produce it. But right now, it's something that retailers don't even necessarily understand where to put it on the shelf. Too often, you may see a German single malt whiskey in the rye whiskey section, or an English rye whiskey, stuck next to the Japanese whiskeys. Nobody really knows what to do with it. So it's a lot of hand-holding, a lot of education. Also in the US, we have the three-tier system, which can be incredibly complicated and difficult to navigate. It's also going to result in a lot of cost. So essentially the way the system works is you have your producers are separated from your distributors, and then your retailers and on-premise accounts. And you can't really sell skipping any of these tiers, and you can't control more than one of those tiers. And so if you are a world whiskey producer, you'll have to sell to an importer, who generally has to sell to a distributor, who then sells to a retailer. With that, there's going to be a lot of markup, a lot of extra costs, and you need to make sure that your prices are in line with what your domestic market looks like. And you're also going to keep in mind that education piece. You'll have to educate each one of the members of each of those tiers and help them better be able to sell your products. It's very important when you're selecting an importer to select somebody that knows what they're doing, that has a passion for craft spirits, has a passion for world whiskey, and understands the category. I've seen it happen too often where people will select an importer because, say you're a German whiskey producer, you may know a German person living in America who's done some kind of business before but has never worked in the alcohol space. That's a very bad idea. You really want to stick to selecting an importer that's going to know how to market your specific class of spirits, that has an interest in that, and is really interested in growing that category. One other thing to think about here in the United States, or there in the United States, is the bottle size issue. Until very recently, the 700 milliliter bottle was not allowed in the US, and so craft producers, particularly in Europe, had trouble with that. We do not currently allow the 500 milliliter bottle either. So you would have to put something into a 750 milliliter or 700 ml size. The smaller sizes just aren't practical in the US. They tend to get stolen, and so store owners don't like to bring them in. Also, another thing to think about in the US is managing your expectations. I think a lot of producers come in and they may be doing really well in their own market, but I want to just tell you, you're not going to sell 10,000 bottles of world whiskey in the US in your first year, unless you are, have some kind of crazy marketing budget that most people don't. So be realistic with your expectations and understand that when you go in. Finally, I just want to touch on what I think are a couple of future trends that maybe I'll be back here to speak about in a handful of years, but I think that one of the next things we're going to see is a push towards world agave as tequila and mezcal continue to grow more popular, but those sides have production issues as well. There are great agave spirits produced all throughout the world in places like Australia and India and South America, and even in the US, there's an agave distillery in Montana. So I think that's going to be a trend, and then following that, I do believe world brandy's coming next. There's too much wine, there's a glut in wine, and instead of pouring it out, they can distill it and make some really high-class spirits as well. So I think this is where the market's going, and hopefully be back to talk about that in the future.